Good morning. This is Peter Schwartz from Salesforce.com. Glad to be with you. And this morning I'm with my friend Steven Johnson to talk about his new book and new PBS series, How We Got to Now. Remarkable book on the evolution of technology. What Walt Isaacson described Steve Johnson as the Darwin of technology. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much. It's so great to be here, Peter.
It's wonderful to be here. So, Steve, you know, we're old friends. I want to talk about a couple of ideas, the big ideas behind this, and also the big ideas behind your last book, Future Perfect.
Great.
But let's begin with this one.
Yep.
So, you know, you're a real intellectual explorer. You like to explore ideas. What led you to this book?
Well, it really came out of a book I wrote 2 books ago called Where Good Ideas Come From, which was a kind of a survey of innovation and innovative people and organizations over history. And really it began with the idea for the show, where I got kind of approached by PBS and a few other people about maybe trying to think about innovation in the format of a TV series. And in thinking about that, we kind of hit on this idea that each segment, each chapter in the book, each episode of the show should be one facet of the modern world that we take for granted, that we're so used to it that we don't even think of it as a technology or an innovation anymore, like a glass of clean drinking water, or glass, the material glass, or artificial light. And the idea was that each kind of segment would then unravel this 500,000-year history of this technology, and also explore all the crazy unintended consequences of where that technology has led us as a society. So in a sense, it's a kind of object technology first vision of history. There are a lot of people, a lot of interesting people that are profiled, but it's almost kind of emphasizing how these ideas and how these machines or these objects actually change society themselves. So, you know,
last night I got to see the first episode.
Right.
It was really great about clean.
Yeah.
Right. There were some great stories there. I mean, for discovery of chlorine in clean water, the San Francisco sewers, and the remarkable tale of lifting Chicago.
Yeah.
You know, in that story, what really surprised you?
Well, in shooting that, I went into, as you said, into the sewers of Chicago, of San Francisco here, and what surprised me there was just how frightened I was. It was really, because we were in San Francisco, so we're underground, and it's awful, and it's very claustrophobic, and all we could think was, there's going to be an earthquake, and I'm going to die, like buried alive, you know, the worst possible way to die, you know. But no, in that episode, I think the story you alluded to about John Leal, who was one of the first people to realize that chlorine could be used in water. You know, chlorine is a poison. If you drink a couple of glasses of this stuff, it'll kill you. But he realized that very small quantities of chlorine would be lethal to bacteria, but not to human beings. And so he decided basically to chlorinate the drinking water of Jersey City in New Jersey. But he couldn't get the kind of popular, you know, public opinion behind this idea of putting a poison in the drinking water, so he just kind of did it. Like, he didn't really get approval for it.
Could you imagine doing that today? My God.
I know. But what I love about it is, you know, he does this, and then because chlorination then rolls out across the country, you know, kind of municipality by municipality, we can see exactly the effects of it. And what chlorination does is that it reduces infant and child mortality by 50%.
That's an amazing number.
It's incredible, isn't it? And you think about all the things in life, like the worst thing in the world that can happen to you as a parent, like the loss of a child, like this chemical, and this, you know, doctor / engineer did something that took that, you know, what was basically a commonplace thing in the 19th century, the loss of a child, and made it, you know, incredibly rare.
And it was typhoid was one of the effects?
Typhoid, yeah. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. And in a large part, that's one of the messages of the book and the show, which is, you know, we talk a lot about innovation in society now, today, but it's not all about the high-tech stuff. You know, some of that, you know, the story of the creativity and ingenuity that made drinking a glass of water not a game of Russian roulette. That's a story of innovation too.
Well, you know, as somebody who's traveled all around the world, in much of the world that still is, it is, you don't drink the water, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, it's hard to imagine what life would be like here without clean water, right?
And it really wasn't that long ago.
No.
You know, we talk about, there's a segment about cholera in London, which is based on a book I wrote called The Ghost Map. It was 150 years ago that people were just, you know, dying in mass numbers, you know, with these outbreaks of cholera in London. London was just an incredibly lethal place to live, and now you go there and it's fantastic.
Well, in fact, when I lived in London, I lived in a place called the Vale of Health in Hampstead Heath, where people would go to escape the cholera epidemic. Hence it was called the Vale of Health. It had clean water.
I love
that
it.
that was the big advantage. It had a well
really cool.
with clean water.
I love it.
Yeah, that's where I actually live. Now, in the second episode, you talk about time.
Yeah.
And you and I were talking about time as a platform. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, it's interesting, in this context here, I think we're pretty accustomed to this idea that platforms, whether they're, kind of software platforms, like the internet or the web or a Salesforce platform, they enable kind of higher level innovation, right? You standardize around a agreed set of terms or protocols, and once you reach agreement, interesting things start to happen on the next layer up. And
well, in fact, right behind us is a whole expo full of companies built on our platform.
Exactly. So once you kind of agree on the terms, you can do interesting things one level up. But it doesn't have to be software. And in fact, time at various points has kind of functioned like a platform. And one of those stories, which is one of my favorite stories in the book and the show, is until the 1880s, every town in America was on basically its own time zone. So you would take a local reading of the sun, you'd look up and be like, okay, it's noon. And so that meant in New York, it was 12 noon, but in New Haven, it was like 12:17. And in Baltimore, it was 11:53. And wherever you went, it would move, kind of minute by minute across from town to town. And the thing about this is that nobody noticed this. It was a problem that wasn't a problem because you didn't have to coordinate your schedules with somebody in another town ever. And what changed all this was the railroad. The railroad comes along, and suddenly people are leaving one town, arriving in another town, and their clocks are off, and they're taking a train whose timetable is actually based on another town's time, and they're connecting to a train whose time is based on another town's time, and so no one could figure out what time it was. And so we had to agree on standardized time. We created the time zone systems. And that became a platform, in a sense, of agreement of this is what time it is everywhere in the United States, and eventually around the world. And the problem that was being solved to deal with railroads ended up enabling, in the 20th century, national media, radio, television, right? You can't say tune in Wednesday nights at 10 p.m. Eastern Time if you haven't agreed on what 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time is. And they weren't even thinking about solving that problem. They were just trying to solve the problem with railroads.
I mean, that's one of the great stories in the sense of something we take totally for granted that nobody thought about, and then suddenly, oh yeah, we need to coordinate time all over the place.
It was really hard, and there was a lot of resistance to it. A lot of towns were like, it's unnatural. The sun should tell us what time it is.
Of course. You could imagine what the pushback might be.
Totally.
You're going to change our time? New Haven for New York? Come on. Yeah, that's a great story. Now, the book is organized around a set of qualities. What are those?
Kind of objects, qualities, glass, time, light, clean, sound, and was that 5 or 6? I can't remember anyway. That's
and each one is built around a set of stories of people and evolution in each of those. Now, when you think about that whole array, were there any things that you were entirely astonished by? I'd never imagined that was true.
Well, in the glass episode is really interesting, and the chapter. It's actually the opening chapter in the book. Maybe my favorite chapter in the book. It's really about how glass arguably is the single most important material of the last 1,000 years. That if you could take away all the things that are made of glass, from telescopes and microscopes to fiber optics, to every lens, every camera, all that stuff, the last 1,000 years of history would be radically transformed.
We wouldn't be having that camera out there.
All these things would not have happened. And the story that really jumped out at me in that, because I thought I knew the story, is the story about Gutenberg. So Gutenberg invents this interesting platform of the printing press. The book gets into circulation. We know this story, right? It changes everything as people begin to read. But this other thing happens, which is that people start to read for the first time, and a certain sizable portion of those people say, I can't read that. I'm farsighted. I can't see very well. That's interesting. And so they need glasses. And so suddenly there's this kind of market signal that goes out throughout Europe that if you can make lenses, you can make some money. And so lens making becomes this kind of pool of expertise in making lenses, spreads through Europe. And because people like to tinker with their inventions, some of them start saying, hey, if you put these two together, like, you could make a telescope. Or if you do this, you could make a microscope. And so that sets in motion Galileo, Hooke, and scientific revolutions. Partially because of Gutenberg, but not for anything to do directly with the book itself.
That's a great story. That set of that cascade of Gutenberg leads to Galileo and down a path you would never imagine.
Yeah.
Well, so tell us, when is the series on?
The series is on it debuted last night. It's on Wednesday nights on PBS at 10 o'clock. It's coming to the BBC early next year and around the world.
And did they get it any other way?
Yeah, it's going to be, it's online. I think it's on all the various PBS.org has it,
right.
streaming,
Good.
and iTunes and things like that.
Well, it should be a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Now let's turn to your previous book, which I really wanted to talk about here before, as you know, and I think it's a remarkable book, Future Perfect. Tell us what the basic premise of the book is.
Well, it's really an argument that there is an interesting new, almost kind of political philosophy that I've been seeing in people around me that I've been influenced by, which is to say, most of the conventional kind of political structure in this country is, between the left and the right. It's between the power of the market, the power of, capitalism, and the power of kind of the state and big government. And where you fall in the political spectrum basically is, the kind of ratio of those two forces that you want to see at work in the world generally. And what I was seeing increasingly was that people were, the people I was most influenced by, were people who were actually, in a sense, championing this other structure that was kind of neither market nor state, which in the book I was calling, peer networks, short for kind of peer-to-peer networks. And it's everything like open source movements, it's everything, the internet, the web, Wikipedia, all of these interesting kind of city organization structures that are popping up where people are kind of solving problems from below, outside of traditional government and also outside of the private sector. And so I was trying to say, well, if you had a political philosophy that was built around peer networks instead of pure markets or pure governments, what would that look like? And I started calling these people peer progressives. And I think what's interesting about it is we can look now at the success of the internet, we can look at the success of the web, we can look at the success of open source, and take a step back and say, here we have these things that society is now completely dependent on, right? I mean, think about the last thought experiment of removing glass from the modern world. Well, remove every piece of open source, kind of software from the world, or everything from the internet to the web to Wikipedia, anything that's basically created by a big collaborative network. The world would grind. If you could turn all those things off, the world would come to a crashing halt.
Sure.
So what would have seemed, you and I both live in Northern California, so if we've been having this conversation 40 years ago about these new collaborative systems without traditional ownership relationships, we would have been like talking on a commune somewhere.
Exactly.
Like weaving baskets.
Hippies.
Right. But now it actually has become a big, scalable, world-changing, world-sustaining way of organizing and solving problems.
Give us a good example.
Well, if you think about it in terms of cities, one of the great examples that I love is a lot of cities around the country have this. New York has really the most advanced version of it, 311.
Right.
So 311 is an amazing thing. You call 3 numbers on a phone, you can report problems, you can ask for services, you can say there's a pothole on my street, or the bar down the way is making too much noise, or I need information about park events. And the city takes in all that information and they tag everything, they geotag everything, and they create this kind of live dashboard for all the problems in the city that are being contributed freely by the citizens of the city. So it's this kind of bottom-up approach to solving this immense problem in a city of 8 million people. The biggest problem is figuring out what are the problems, like what are the unmet needs of this vast kind of superorganism of the city. And 311 basically creates this huge peer network of ordinary people who are not on the payroll of the government, who are nonetheless happily contributing their ideas, their problems to things that they've spotted.
Well, I don't think you know this, but 311 often runs on Salesforce.
I'm sure it does. It doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, our service cloud actually is behind a lot of 311 networks.
I bet. Yeah.
Great call. Well done. Well done.
I do my part.
Yeah. So, it seems to me this is actually a really quite fundamental change. Yeah. And the ability of people to collaborate, the ability of people to participate, the ability to influence decision-making in ways they haven't before. It seems to me a kind of historic reversal of power from central hierarchies to a highly distributed power system.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it is a particularly interesting, in the real world, I mean, we can see what it's doing online and how many things that are now organized, kind of beginning in a way with Wikipedia, that's something that just shouldn't work, right? It just, but I imagine certainly I would have said 15 years ago, told about the idea for Wikipedia, I would say, I love it, I wish that would work, but it'll never actually work, But now we're seeing these things migrating over into the real world, and there are things like, movements like participatory budgeting in cities.
Yes.
People are like, kind of people are given a slice of the budget for their neighborhoods and communities, and they have these sessions and meetings, many of them face-to-face, where they say, what we need is a new sewer line, what we need is a new school, and they're actually making the decisions. And those kinds of systems, I think, are amplified by this amazing technology that we have. But it's also, as you said, it's a philosophical shift, right? It's an awareness that these collaborative networks can work, and that they're not just doomed to kind of lowest common denominator, groupthink. They can actually solve problems more effectively than traditional hierarchies.
Well, I'm really struck by, in the protesters in Hong Kong, right?
Oh, right.
They're using a piece of software called FireChat. And FireChat basically is Bluetooth networks that go from phone to phone and instantly create a network of communications outside government control. It's peer-to-peer network, self-organizing, bottom-up, instantaneous network throughout all the protesters. And each one just said, oh, here, download the app, pass on the app, and it just, in literally hours, all of them were connected and self-organized from the bottom up.
Well, the other example of this that involves protest is Twitter and hashtags, right? So kind of a lovely two layers to this. First off, hashtags themselves were not part of the original Twitter plan, right? They were something that the users of Twitter spontaneously started to do. And eventually the folks inside kind of Twitter headquarters were like, okay, we should make this part of our service. But of course they were central to the protest movement. So Occupy Wall Street was a hashtag for 3 months before it was an actual protest movement. I mean,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it started where they started sending around this hashtag Occupy Wall Street. And then after 3 months, people were like, you know what? Let's actually occupy Wall Street. What if we went there and hung out? So, and you can debate the role of Twitter and Arab Spring and all sorts of things, but it's clearly that hashtags kind of spawn Occupy. And I just love this idea that here you have a use of the technology itself. The convention of hashtagging comes from the bottom up. It's an emergent phenomenon of the network in a sense. And then a specific use of it as engendering a new kind of protest movement comes from the use of that hashtag. So you see that structure again and again and again.
Now, do you think this is going to influence conventional politics? I mean, we got the Democrats and the Republicans. I mean, how does this play out in the world of conventional politics?
Well, it's clear, it's interesting. The first place that it has influenced conventional politics, not surprisingly, is money, right? So the kind of small donor phenomenon and the networks, it began really with the Howard Dean campaign. That was the beginning of this in a way, and that Obama really captured extremely well in 2008. But that's kind of depressing. I feel like, if the question is there a kind of decision-making mechanism for national politics whereby we can be more involved the way that you can be involved in your city with 311 or participatory budgeting? Could you do that on a kind of a national level? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that. It's going to be really interesting to see.
Well, this when you think about this, things like Kickstarter, for example, is another example.
Great example.
Or the peer-to-peer lending and so on. It does strike me that there's something very real going on here in the nature of power and the way the economy will work. We were talking about this with John Hagel the other day. What these connected networks, what that's likely to be.
Well, the one thing actually that I haven't thought about, we should go back and revisit it, but when Obama was elected, they had this, I can't remember what they called it, but they had this open call for what should our national priorities be? In this style. It was like a Wikipedia style. And everybody made fun of it because the #1 thing that came out on top of the list is legalized marijuana.
And
at the time it seemed like this crazy thing. This is what happens when you let the internet vote, but actually it turns out to be like they were ahead of the curve.
It is. So we only have a few more seconds. What's the next project?
Well, there is some discussion of doing another season of the show.
Oh, really? So
which would have another
more
book.
Areas?
We would go into a new terrain of some sort.
What do you want to explore that you haven't?
Either something fun, like leisure and recreation and all the things we do for fun, or death and murder and disease. It has to be really good or really dark, one or the other.
Great. Thanks for being with us, Steve.
Thanks,
Great. Good luck with the book. Good luck with the series.
Thank you.